Hello guys, how have you been? I hope that despite the novel coronavirus, you are doing good in your respective abode. Welcome back to another session of the three-part series Developing Materials for the Acquisition of Language. To begin with, we will be doing this activity wherein you will match the words in column A to their synonyms in column B. You may want to use the dictionary, but then I will only be giving you a minute in order for you to look for the synonyms of the words in column A to the respective synonym in column B. So your time starts now. Time's up. Okay, let's try to see how you did with your answers. So for fungible, its synonym is letter E, interchangeable. Alacrity is obligingness. Suavity is politeness. Famished is hungry. Rife is wrench. Outlandish is bizarre. And obsequious is compliant. So how many did you get correct? Well, nevertheless, this is just an activity wherein additional vocabulary is developed, and I hope you learned at least one or two words today. Moving on, as mentioned earlier, this is the second part of the three-part series, developing materials for the acquisition of language, specifically lexical competence. A quick review on the first part of this series, developing materials for the acquisition of grammatical competence. In order for students to acquire the said competence, they should be provided with multiple opportunities for extensive reading, listening, and viewing, and for authentic interaction both outside and inside the classroom should be provided to students. And indeed, when they are exposed to multiple opportunities where they will be able to deduce the meaning of the words in context, where they will be able to deduce how words are arranged in a certain sentence in order to create the meaning that fulfills the function they need. At the same time, when they are using their grammar and practicing it in communication, then they will be able indeed to acquire grammatical competence. Next is the differentiation of forms-focused and form-focused instruction and material. The former, forms-focused instruction and materials, focuses on teaching a predetermined language item or feature, which is usually accomplished using the PPP approach or the presentation, practice, and production, while the latter, the form focus, pays attention to meaning and use of language. So it's the latter that fulfills the first point that we have discussed earlier. For this lesson presentation, we have the following learning objectives. First, we should be able to differentiate pedagogical approaches in materials for the acquisition of lexical competence. Then, we will be able to develop principles for developing materials in acquisition of lexical competence. Last is to relate how learner-centered pedagogical approach in developing materials for acquisition of lexical competence. Vocabulary has now gained its rightful place next to grammar. It has gained the center stage in literature, on language teaching, and is becoming far more prominent in language learning materials too. In many course books, you may notice the following activities that thus provide vocabulary development activities. The sentence completion, matching phrases to meanings like what we did earlier with the activity, explaining the meaning of the words in bold, practice exercises, text manipulation exercises, and identification exercises. However, none of the activities seems to be input-rich, nor to involve interpretation of lexical items in contextual use, nor the discovery of meaning from context, text creation, or using lexical items for communication. And the same is true with other course books. Thus, Tomlinson and Ellis in 1980 made the following criteria for selection and grading of lexical items. First, words should occur often, that would be frequency, and then it should occur in a particular type of context, which would be availability. At the same time, an item should be easy to teach, which is teachability, and then an item should have the capacity to take place of other items, which would be coverage. Mukundan also has the following reminders on learning vocabulary. First, words should be repeated. He said that words should be repeated at least 7 times over a space interval. In addition, they cannot remember many new words introduced at the same time over a short time. Thus, it should be repeated again and again in various contexts. At the same time, it should be recycled. This is when students will encounter them in various contexts at the same time, apply it in various contexts wherein they will be able to deduce meaning while doing so. At this point of time, we will be having this worksheet activity wherein I will be providing you with the worksheet similar with this wherein if you have the reading with you on developing materials for the acquisition of lexical competence, I would want you to fill up this table with the differentiation of pedagogical approaches for acquisition of lexical competence. So you will be identifying the strengths and weaknesses of each pedagogical approach mentioned in the text. At the same time, at the latter part of the worksheet, you'll be able to write 5 principles about pedagogical approaches and developing materials for the acquisition of lexical competence. I have made mine and this is what I'm going to show you today, though you'll be able to add more if you do your own worksheet. The first on my list is Nation's pedagogical approach, which has the following strengths. Paul Nation, by the way, is one of the leading experts on the teaching and learning of vocabulary. So, his pedagogical approach involves the noticing, retrieving, and elaborating conditions. Noticing, according to him, is learning what we focus on, and in retrieving, it involves the recalling of the meaning or part of the meaning of a form when hearing or reading it or when wanting to express a meaning through speech or writing. Elaborating, on the other hand, is meeting a known word in multiple contexts. Next is the space-receptive retrieval of appropriate vocabulary. According to him, there are 3,000 words that students should focus on first because these are vocabularies which are used repeatedly. Next, extensive reading or how many students read throughout the span of their language learning. At the same time, intensive reading and listening is also made value or the critical reading of text and such materials. Next is the asking of post-listening and reading questions which are necessary in order for students to develop critical thinking and the increasing of knowledge of words through various activities. Paul Nation's pedagogical approach, however, has the following weaknesses. First is that the teacher is the one who identifies and defines new words prior to reading and listening, which may lessen the time the students will be able to do the same for themselves. And then the use of glossaries instead of context clues, and the skimming through text looking for new words instead of learning the words bit by bit, and then the memorization of definitions and the encouragement of intolerance of ambiguity. However, nation suggestions for fluency development includes easy demands, meaning focus, and opportunity to perform. Tomlinson agrees with this, especially that easy demands includes the most common words used in various texts, and then the focus and meaning and the opportunity to use the same lexis in various opportunities of communication. Next is Malley's pedagogical approach, which has the following strengths: repeated meaning of words in context, 25% of teaching time devoted to explicit teaching. So unlike Paul Nation's pedagogical approach, here instead of 100%, only 25% of the teaching time is used in teaching explicitly or teaching the words and its definition from the teacher. Next is the in-class activities. As mentioned earlier, the explicit instruction, which is 25% of teaching time, student use and experience of words, and the out-of-class activities such as extensive reading, creative writing, and self-study activities. Malice, however, has not mentioned any weaknesses in her pedagogical approach. Thus, these vocabulary activities should have or should at least adhere to nation's guidelines. First is for these activities to facilitate vocabulary learning, the goal of vocabulary activities, and for these activities to give teachers lesser work and a balance of meaning focused input, meaning focused output, language focused learning, and fluency development, all of which constitutes vocabulary development. And for these activities to be efficient in such a way that it includes students learning vocabulary and for this vocabulary to be used many times. A third pedagogical approach mentioned, or method to be precise, is the flashcard learning, cloze exercises, and crossword puzzles. According to Nakata and Webb in 2016, using Nations and Webb's technique feature analysis that determines which components of these activities contribute to learning based on the criteria of motivation, noticing, retrieval, generation, and retention is necessary. These three mentioned activities usually occur in course books. Thus, these are the strengths they identified. Flashcard learning is an effective means of retrieval or the getting of new words. And crossword puzzles prove to be motivating, or it allowed the students to be motivated or driven to accomplish the activity. However, flashcard learning has a limited ability to promote generation or the generation of meaning, the discovery of meaning. And crossword puzzles is less effective in generation and retention of this vocabulary. As well as, these activities are not input rich, akin to the first activities that we have discussed earlier, used by most course books. And none of these activities involves interpretation in context. Next to this is Dellar and Wolke's pedagogical approach with the following strengths provided. First, grammar and lexis are taught in combination, which is very good, wherein students learn grammar and lexicon together. And contextualization is made essential, as mentioned in previous pedagogical approaches. At the same time, there is a stress, richness, and utility of input. So input is very much focused. Without any weaknesses determined in the last pedagogical approach, we proceed with the principles I have developed, and you may add or subtract or ask questions later on. First, students should be provided with activities where they meet words in context, as was discussed repeatedly over and over earlier in various pedagogical approaches. Next is the focus on the most frequently used words. According to Nation, these words are the most words used in various texts, amounting to 3,000, while Mukunda narrowed it down to 2,000. Nevertheless, despite the number, the most frequently used words in text should be the ones introduced to students at the early years of language learning. Next is the value of extensive and intensive reading while focusing on salient lexical items, and the presentation of new items together with known items, and the usage of existing linguistic resources, wherein once they have retrieved and generated various lexicon, they will be able to apply it in various communication contexts. Tomlinson's recommendations includes the following: incidental and incremental learning through meaningful experience. They said that it's better for students to develop or discover the words for themselves and develop the meaning of such words gradually. Next is for rich and varied text for extensive reading, listening, and viewing to be presented and recommended to students. Again, text-driven and task-based approach is the one he recommends in order for students to thus learn a form-focused instruction and material of acquiring lexicon. Next, vocabulary activities are necessary but with teacher's guidance. However, too much of explicit instruction may hinder students to discover for themselves the meaning of the words they encounter. Finally, is the recording of new words in a notebook in order for students to have a record of the new words they encounter and a definition they made themselves. As you may have noticed, all of these activities are, as well as the principles, are all learner-centered, wherein the teachers are put at the student's side in order for teachers to help the students discover and facilitate their learning. So for the final part of the worksheet would be an essay or a reflection of this verse. For the Lord giveth wisdom, out of his mouth cometh knowledge and understanding. How does this verse relate to the principles and pedagogical approaches in acquiring vocabulary? Personally, I do believe that it is the Lord who gives people and students their wisdom, and out of his mouth cometh knowledge and understanding. Therefore, it is necessary to use the Bible as one of the core texts in learning vocabulary. I hope that this presentation enabled you to come up with activities not similar with the first activity we did, but much more um, meaningful to the students. At the same time, may it enable them to acquire lexical competence. For the next part of the presentation, we will be dealing with developing materials for the acquisition of pragmatic competence. I hope that the presentation will be of value to you. See you and God bless.